My name is Victoria Lawson. I'm 34 years old and I own a duplex near the coast of Oregon. I was on a short business trip when my phone buzzed on the hotel nightstand, not with a call or a text, but with a security alert from my house. Motion detected. Living room. I opened the camera feed expecting a false alarm or a shadow passing by. Instead, I watched my front door swing open from the inside. Boxes came in first, stacked with purpose, followed by furniture I recognized, and then voices that spoke with the kind of confidence people only have when they believe they're entitled to a space. I turned the volume up just in time to hear my father say calmly and without hesitation, "Once everything is here, she will not make a scene. She will have to accept it." I didn't react. I didn't interrupt. I didn't call anyone. I kept watching. I watched my home being reorganized by people who didn't live there and had never paid for it. I noticed details that made it impossible to dismiss this as confusion: a delivery package sitting by the stairs with someone else's name on it, boxes already labeled by room decisions clearly made long before that moment. This wasn't a favor. This wasn't temporary. This was a plan already halfway finished while I was hundreds of miles away. They assumed distance meant silence, and silence meant permission. They assumed I would come home, see what had been done, and adjust myself around it like I always had. They were right about one thing. I didn't make a scene. But what they didn't realize was that silence doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it means preparation. I closed the camera app, opened my laptop, and booked a one-way flight home. I wasn't going back to argue, explain, or ask for understanding. I was going back to let them finish what they started, because that was the only way they would understand what it cost. Before the story continues, take a moment to subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. What happened next didn't just change my relationship with my family, it ended it. It didn't slow down after that. If anything, it accelerated. I checked the camera again a short while later, then again after that, each time telling myself it would be the last, and each time seeing something new that made it impossible to look away. A chair from my dining area had been dragged closer to the window, positioned like it belonged there. A box I kept in the guest room filled with old work files was now sitting near the back door. Then I saw her cross the living room, holding a small pile of my things, not dumping them or damaging them, just relocating them with the casual efficiency of someone clearing space for herself. The way she moved mattered more than what she moved. There was no hesitation in her steps, no glance around like she was worried someone might stop her. She acted like the house had already agreed to her presence. That was when I realized how quickly appearances could work against me. From the outside, this would look like someone slowly settling in, not an intrusion, but a transition. Neighbors would see a familiar face coming and going. Deliveries would keep arriving. The longer it continued, the more difficult it would be to challenge without sounding unreasonable. I didn't need a lawyer to understand that momentum creates legitimacy long before paperwork ever does. I closed the feed and stared at my screen for a moment, not angry yet, but focused the way you get when you know timing is about to matter more than emotion. I opened my banking app and started scrolling back further than I ever had before, past the recent transactions, past the months that still felt current into years I rarely thought about anymore. Small amounts appeared, first payments that had been easy to justify because they didn't feel permanent. Help with rent, a last-minute expense, something urgent that somehow never came with a follow-up. Then larger numbers showed up, spaced far enough apart that I hadn't connected them before. Each transfer came with a story attached, each story framed as temporary, necessary family. None of it had ever come with a plan for repayment, or even an acknowledgement once the money left my account. Seeing it all laid out like that stripped the excuses away. This wasn't support, it was access without limits. I had confused being needed with being valued, and that confusion had trained everyone around me to expect compliance instead of consent. I checked the camera again, and watched her pacing through the living room, phone pressed to her ear, pointing toward the wall where my bookshelf used to be, smiling as if she were describing something that was already hers. That image did something final to my thinking. I stopped wondering how to talk my way out of this, or how to smooth it over without causing damage. The damage was already happening. The only question left was whether I would let it finish quietly. Family had been the word I used to excuse behavior like this for years, but standing there watching my life be rearranged from a distance, the word lost its weight. What mattered wasn't blood or history or intention. What mattered was ownership and boundaries, and the fact that both were being tested in real time. I understood then that acting too soon would only give them the chance to minimize what they were doing, to reframe it as harmless or misunderstood. Waiting deliberately and without interruption would allow the truth to solidify on its own. That was the moment my role changed. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was observing, measuring, and preparing to respond in a way that couldn't be dismissed once it happened. The next step wasn't emotional, it was intentional. I met Monica Perez later that day because ignoring what other people were already seeing felt more reckless than facing it head-on. Monica wasn't connected to my family in any meaningful way, which meant she had no reason to soften what she knew. She didn't ease into the conversation or ask how I was holding up. She told me directly that Julia had been speaking about staying long-term well before anyone started carrying boxes inside my house, and she hadn't framed it as a question or a trial period. Monica described it as settled language, the kind people use when they believe logistics are already aligned. She mentioned timelines that had been casually referenced, remarks about which rooms would be used, and comments about how inconvenient it would be to move twice once everything was in place. What stood out wasn't just the content, it was the confidence behind it. This wasn't gossip. It was expectation. When I asked why she was bringing this to me now, Monica didn't hesitate. She said she didn't like being part of conversations that relied on someone else staying uninformed to work. She wasn't taking sides, and she made that clear more than once. She wasn't there to defend Julia, and she wasn't there to protect me. Her concern was accuracy. Then she reached into her bag and placed a slim folder on the table between us. Inside were copies of documents I hadn't authorized, but recognized immediately by what they referenced. My address appeared more than once. So did notes that implied continuity rather than permission. There were utility-related records, delivery confirmations, and administrative forms that assumed ongoing access to the property. None of it carried my signature, but all of it treated my home as a fixed point in someone else's plans. Monica didn't speculate about how they got there, or why. She simply said that paperwork like this doesn't materialize unless someone expects it to matter. She also made it clear that she hadn't signed, submitted, or initiated any of it. She had noticed the pattern and decided not to ignore it. What unsettled me most was how calmly she laid everything out. There was no outrage in her voice, no warning tone meant to scare me into action. She spoke the way people do when they're stating facts they assume you'll recognize as serious without needing them emphasized. Listening to her, I understood that whatever I thought was happening privately within my family had already moved into a public enough space that other people were adjusting their behavior around it. That meant the situation no longer belonged to me alone. It had developed a life outside my awareness, and that made it far more difficult to contain. Monica didn't offer advice, and she didn't tell me what choice to make. She said one thing that stayed with me long after the conversation ended, that once others begin organizing around assumptions tied to your property, it stops being a personal disagreement and becomes a structural problem. That was the moment I let go of the idea that another careful conversation could fix this. I had handled similar situations quietly in the past, trusting that patience would eventually reset expectations. But patience only works when everyone is operating with the same information, and I clearly hadn't been. This wasn't confusion, it was coordination, and coordination doesn't dissolve just because someone finally objects. As I gathered the folder and stood to leave, It was clear to me that trying to reason my way out of this would only give the situation more time to harden. The truth was already documented, already referenced, already moving independently of my consent. Pretending otherwise wouldn't protect me. It would only make me easier to bypass. That meeting stripped the situation down to facts. I sat across from Daniel Scott the next day, not looking for comfort or outrage, but for definition. Daniel didn't waste time asking about family dynamics or emotional history. He asked for documentation proof of ownership, closing records, utility statements, anything that established a clear line between what belonged to me and what didn't. He reviewed everything carefully and then stated without hesitation that the duplex was mine alone, that no one else had a legal right to occupy it, store belongings there, or act on its behalf without explicit permission. He was careful to separate morality from law. Feeling wrong and being unlawful were not the same thing, and strategy depended on understanding that difference. Once that foundation was set, the conversation shifted. Daniel explained that confronting the situation too early would weaken my position, not strengthen it. Immediate opposition would invite excuses, confusion, and emotional rewriting, turning documented behavior into a debate about intentions. What mattered wasn't what anyone claimed they believed it was, what they chose to do when they thought no one was stopping them. He advised restraint not as passivity, but as control. Let actions continue. Let patterns form. Let the behavior become consistent enough that it could not be explained away as accidental or misunderstood. We discussed the value of witnesses who weren't part of the family, people whose presence would later establish that what happened wasn't private or ambiguous. Daniel emphasized that legality relies on visibility, on the ability to demonstrate conduct without interpretation. The cleaner the record, the less room there would be for denial. As we talked, I checked the camera feed again and saw confirmation of everything he was describing. She moved through the house with increasing ease, shifting furniture, placing personal items in fixed locations, treating the space like something already claimed. There was no hesitation in her movements, no signs of uncertainty or caution. From a legal perspective, Daniel explained that confidence mattered. People who believe they have permission behave differently than people who know they don't, and that distinction becomes critical when timelines and actions are examined later. He advised against warnings, against reclaiming space prematurely, against doing anything that would interrupt the natural progression of what was already underway. The goal wasn't to stop it immediately, it was to allow it to become undeniable. By the end of the meeting, the emotional weight I had been carrying since the first alert had been replaced by something sharper and more focused. I understood that this wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about letting assumptions turn into documented behavior and documented behavior turn into consequences. The plan didn't rely on cooperation or honesty from anyone else. It relied on patience, timing, and the simple act of letting people reveal exactly how far they were willing to go when they believed the outcome was already decided. I left, knowing that the most powerful move I could make at that moment was not to interfere, but to watch carefully and allow the record to write itself. When I arrived, the house was already in motion, not chaotic, but coordinated, the kind of movement that happens when people believe permission has been settled. Cars lined the curb, a rented truck idled with its back door open, and strangers moved with purpose, carrying furniture through an entryway that no longer reacted to me as the owner. Inside, voices overlapped with instructions, someone calling out where boxes should go, another person asking which room was which, all of it unfolding as if the decision had been made days ago, and everyone else had simply shown up to execute it. I stepped into the living area without announcing myself and felt the shift immediately, the subtle recalibration that happens when a space treats you like an observer instead of an authority. A man carrying a shelving unit asked Julia where it belonged, and she answered without hesitation, pointing down the hall and explaining how she wanted the room set up. Raymond noticed me then, and his expression tightened, not with surprise, but with irritation, as though my timing was inconvenient. He spoke quickly and confidently, saying there was no need to escalate anything, that this was a practical arrangement, that families handled things internally and didn't turn them into standoffs. When I didn't respond, he went further, reframing the house as a shared family asset, something built by collective effort, and therefore governed by collective decision, not by a single name on a document. He said it the way people do when they expect agreement, using familiarity to replace consent. Julia watched closely, then stated calmly and out loud that she was staying, that the move made sense, that everything was already here, and that undoing it would be disruptive for everyone involved. She didn't look at me when she said it, addressing the room instead, as if announcing a plan rather than seeking approval. The people around us went quiet, not because they understood the details, but because they could feel a boundary being tested in public. Raymond reinforced her statement, dismissing paperwork as technical noise and insisting that decisions like this didn't require permission when the intention was reasonable. He framed resistance as selfishness, positioning himself as the voice of balance, while claiming the right to decide what balance looked like. I said nothing. I stood there long enough for the moment to settle, long enough for the absence of objection to be interpreted as acceptance by the people who wanted it to be. I knew I could stop everything right then. I didn't. Someone resumed moving boxes. Another person asked Julia where a dresser should go, and she answered with specifics, choosing a wall, explaining spacing, acting with the confidence of someone who believed the question had already been settled. Raymond nodded along, satisfied, his posture relaxing as the room adjusted around the version of reality he was presenting. What unfolded next wasn't dramatic, but it was definitive. Decisions continued to be made without hesitation, instructions were followed, and roles were assumed openly in front of witnesses who would remember who spoke, who deferred, and who claimed authority. The house became quieter in a different way, not calm, but resolved, as if momentum itself had become the deciding factor. I stayed present without intervening, allowing the behavior to continue uninterrupted, letting certainty reveal itself through action rather than argument. When I stepped back, it wasn't retreat, it was refusal to interrupt a process that had already crossed the line it pretended not to see. Nothing was shouted, nothing was corrected, and nothing was undone, but the assumption that had carried them this far was now visible to everyone in the room, solid and unmistakable. The moment didn't announce itself. Monica Perez entered the room, while the last of the boxes were still being moved, her presence calm enough to feel out of place, carrying a thin folder that immediately drew attention because she didn't try to claim it. She walked to the dining table, placed the folder flat between us, and said there was something that needed to be addressed before anything else continued. No one argued. She opened it and slid a document forward, explaining that it had been submitted as authorization connected to the property, an approval that had been used to justify long-term access and occupancy. I took the paper and studied it carefully, not for effect, but for accuracy, comparing the signature at the bottom to the way my name actually looked when I wrote it. The discrepancies were small, but undeniable, the curve of the letters hesitant, the pressure uneven, the spacing inconsistent with my hand. I stated evenly and without emphasis that the signature was not mine. The room reacted before anyone spoke. Monica confirmed that the document had been flagged because it did not match the ownership records or previous verified signatures. Daniel Scott stepped in, then his tone controlled and deliberate, explaining that submitting authorization under an invalid signature constituted misrepresentation, that any access or changes made under that assumption were legally vulnerable, and that continued presence after notice could escalate into trespass with financial penalties attached. He didn't raise his voice or personalize the explanation. He described outcomes, not accusations. Julia reacted immediately, her composure collapsing into rapid denial, insisting she had been told everything was clear, that she wouldn't have moved in, otherwise that someone had assured her the paperwork was handled. Her voice rose as certainty gave way to panic, the confidence she had been operating under dissolving in real time. Raymond tried to regain control, dismissing the document as technical, arguing that intent mattered more than form, that families didn't operate by signatures and filings. Daniel responded without engaging the argument, stating that intent had already been demonstrated and that formality was what determined enforceability, not familiarity. The explanation landed differently this time. The room shifted as people realized they were no longer watching a family disagreement, but the collapse of a claim. My parents began asking questions that didn't connect to each other, trying to understand how something they believed was settled could suddenly be exposed as unstable. Their expressions moved from confusion to concern as the implications became clearer, not just about the house, but about what they had unknowingly supported. Julia lost control entirely, her words sharp and defensive, accusing the situation of being unfair, insisting that no one had stopped her before, that silence had been permission. Monica remained detached, stating only that assumptions were not authorization and that the record now reflected that distinction. Raymond's authority drained visibly, his tone shifting from certainty to justification, as he realized the position he had asserted could not survive scrutiny. I said nothing during the exchange, not because I lacked something to say, but because nothing needed reinforcement. The facts had done what confrontation never could. The narrative they had relied on unraveled without argument, leaving only documentation, witnesses, and consequences in its place. By the time the room settled, the confidence that had carried the move this far was gone, replaced by the quiet understanding that the situation was no longer governed by belief, intention, or family hierarchy, but by reality they could not rewrite. The fallout didn't arrive with shouting or slam doors. It unfolded the way real consequences usually do, quietly and without drama, leaving no room for reinterpretation. As people began clearing out of the house, Raymond's phone vibrated again, followed almost immediately by Irene's. They tried to ignore it at first, silencing the screens out of habit, but the notifications kept stacking. Credit monitoring alerts don't ask for permission, and they don't care about context. They report exactly what has happened. Raymond finally looked, his face tightening as he scrolled through the details. Accounts flagged balances, updated reminders of obligations he thought were still months away, suddenly marked as overdue. Irene leaned closer, her confusion turning to alarm, as she realized this wasn't a single issue, but several converging at the same time. The financial problems they had managed quietly for years, the ones they believed could be covered or delayed with help, were no longer contained. The structure that had absorbed those pressures had collapsed. Instead of addressing what the alerts meant, they turned toward me. Raymond said this never should have gone that far, that involving paperwork and third parties had triggered a chain reaction that could have been avoided if I hadn't escalated the situation. Irene followed, her voice strained, accusing me of making things public, of turning a family matter into something official, something that now carried consequences beyond their control. The accusation wasn't subtle. I was being blamed for the outcome, not the actions that caused it. I listened without interrupting, recognizing the shift for what it was. When denial fails, blame becomes the next line of defense. I told them they needed to leave the house. I didn't raise my voice or soften the words. I stated it plainly, explaining that they no longer had permission to be there and that remaining would create additional legal exposure they couldn't afford. Daniel placed the documents on the table without comment, outlining the boundary clearly, a formal no trespass notice that removed any ambiguity about future access. Raymond argued that paperwork couldn't erase family, that enforcing it this way would permanently damage relationships. I responded that relationships don't override ownership or responsibility, and that the damage had been accumulating long before it was acknowledged. Julia tried to insert herself, her frustration resurfacing, but the confidence she had relied on earlier was gone. The reality of the situation had shifted, and no one was stepping in to buffer her from it anymore. I informed them that all financial support would end immediately. There would be no exceptions, no transitional assistance, no quiet continuation framed as help. Every payment, every transfer, every unspoken expectation of coverage was finished. The system they had depended on without recognizing it had been shut down. Irene began to cry not loudly but with the fatigue of someone facing consequences they had postponed for too long. Raymond stood rigid, his anger slowly giving way to calculation, as he began to grasp what losing that support actually meant in practical terms. I didn't negotiate or explain further. The decision wasn't emotional. It was necessary. When they gathered their things and left, there was no confrontation at the door, no final exchange meant to resolve anything. There was only the quiet weight of change settling into the space. The house returned to stillness, not the tense quiet of avoidance, but the clarity that follows a boundary enforced. What they carried out with them wasn't just their belongings, but the assumption that I would always absorb the cost of keeping everything stable. That assumption no longer applied, and the consequences once deferred were now entirely theirs to manage. Months passed, and the duplex didn't just become quiet, it became predictable in the best possible way. The kind of quiet that doesn't wait to be broken. The systems I put in place did what systems are meant to do when they're respected. Access was restricted to verified authorization, only locks were reprogrammed keys, accounted for cameras maintained by a third party, and property oversight moved entirely out of informal hands. Nothing relied on memory, habit, or trust anymore. Everything ran on documentation and consent. The house responded to rules, not relationships. Julia dealt with the aftermath on her own, without financial support, without someone stepping in to smooth over consequences. She adjusted the only way left by taking responsibility. She relocated again, handled deposits and timelines without assistance, and learned quickly that urgency doesn't convert into entitlement when there's no one left to subsidize it. There were no filings that reached my desk, no claims that survived review, no attempts that held up under scrutiny. Whatever certainty she once had dissolved when it stopped being reinforced. Raymond and Irene faced their own recalibration. Credit issues didn't resolve themselves quietly the way they had hoped, and obligations couldn't be postponed indefinitely once the safety net was gone. They downsized expectations, renegotiated commitments, and confronted the reality that financial decisions have long memories. I learned this indirectly through administrative updates and shared acquaintances, not through direct appeals. That distance mattered. There were a few attempts at contact over time, messages framed carefully to avoid asking for anything concrete, but none of them crossed into territory that required engagement. I didn't respond. Not out of resentment, but because reopening communication would have reopened negotiation, and negotiation was the problem from the beginning. What surprised me most was how quickly normal settled in. The fear that cutting ties would leave a void turned out to be unfounded. The void had existed before, masked by constant management. Once the expectation of intervention disappeared, so did the chaos. The duplex became a stable asset again, not just financially, but psychologically. I stopped checking alerts compulsively. I stopped anticipating emergencies that weren't mine to resolve. The space held steady because nothing was pushing against its boundaries anymore. There was no final confrontation, no reconciliation scene designed to soften the outcome. Closure arrived through consistency, through time passing without disruption, through the absence of crisis. The family had no legal route back and no personal one either. That distinction wasn't symbolic, it was functional. Relationships that depend on access without permission aren't relationships, they're liabilities, and liabilities don't belong in a structure meant to last. I didn't frame what happened as loss. Nothing essential was taken from me. What ended was an arrangement built on silence and assumed compliance, one that required constant correction to keep from collapsing. Ending it wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of maintenance. The quiet that followed wasn't empty or sad. It was stable. I moved forward without monitoring, without bracing, without preparing for the next boundary violation disguised as necessity. Ownership was clear, access was defined, responsibility rested where it belonged. There was nothing left to fix, nothing left to explain, and no reason to revisit decisions that had already proven themselves. The story didn't resolve into forgiveness or understanding, and it didn't need to. It concluded the only way it could have, with separation enforced systems intact, and the certainty that peace doesn't come from keeping everyone close, it comes from keeping the right things protected. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to leave a comment, sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.